Hi, everyone. This is Shelley Taylor with the Aspen Family Business Group. It does take a minute for everyone to load in from the waiting room. So as that happens, as you are all joining us, we'll start out with a little bit of housekeeping. First, a little change in cast of characters. Today, we have Danelle Nunes and me, Shelley Taylor. Natalie McVeigh was supposed to be also with us on this webinar, and unforeseen professional circumstance. Everything's okay with her, but just it was a little thing, and I'm filling in. So you get me and Danelle today. We're happy to have you with us. We have enabled the Q&A feature for this webinar. Those of you who have joined us before, welcome back. Those who are new this time, welcome. The Q&A feature enables you to remain anonymous if you so choose when you interact or answer a question. We do encourage you to please use that feature because we want this to be as interactive as possible. And so Danelle Nunes, he's our Director of Innovation and one of the co-founders of our nonprofit, along with me and several others of us, and happy to share this webinar with him today. This is part 2 of our job descriptions and performance management webinar. Part 1 was the broader picture, and we talked about family business life cycles and development and leadership development. We are really getting very practical and hands-on and giving you some clear strategies and takeaways to put to use right away this time. We aim to do in all our webinars, but this one we have a lot for you here today. And I am going to hand it over to Danelle.
Thank you, Shelley. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Yeah, to Shelley's point, sort of the last time that we got together on the topic of job descriptions and performance management, we were talking a lot about how the different stages and life cycles within family enterprise can impact the way that this particular area is handled, thinking about what it's like with entrepreneurial life cycle, when things move into durability and you're looking at the organization having to put more formal structures in place to support the growth past the entrepreneur, and then thinking about into the legacy stage and the different demands that those things place on how you approach this. We also talked about the concept of time and experience and how one thing that can be common in family enterprise is to think of time as the only metric that needs to be considered when you're determining what experience a person has, and how you can kind of optimize the developmental outcomes when you include intentional development opportunities mixed in with that time. We talked about succession as a multifaceted process and need to be thinking about things like how do we optimize the way that we're assessing internal talent? How are we looking at the process for recruiting external talent and making sure that we have qualified people in positions both now and going into the future? We touched on a concept of the job audit, and this one is really an important first step oftentimes in doing job descriptions and job performance. And what this is about is when you have people in an organization at different levels, basically take a notebook and keep it with them for a determined amount of time. And their task is to write down everything that they do in their job, from high-level decisions to things that might be sort of more mundane, and using that to capture what exactly is that person's contribution and responsibility. And then lastly, thinking about all of this as something that is dynamic, where it's not just about a younger member or someone else rising up into leadership, that in order for someone to rise into leadership, there has to be space made for them to move into. And that often means that the person who's at the helm, who's highly capable and has done a lot to get the business to where this is even a possibility, might need to be figuring out what their own next chapter looks like in a way that's meaningful and engaging for them, and is time to help them feel comfortable in creating the space for another person to occupy in leadership. So today, what we're going to do is be thinking about how to make this all more actionable. And we're going to do that by using a list of 5 prompts that's going to be a toolbox item that you guys will have access to after this webinar. And the idea with this is that when we capture things in writing, we raise the possibility that expectations are visible and fair. And so we have a question prompt for you before I go into this, which is, what is one expectation related to succession that, if clearly written down, could reduce friction? And we have that in the chat box. And Shelley, I think we need the slides up.
Yes, the slides would be good. And yeah, so just think about that question for a minute. And that's the implication here is that we often have a lot of expectations of others, of ourselves. Others have them for us, but we don't always specifically state those expectations. Some families have unwritten rules, some businesses have unwritten rules, but our message, our reasoning, our thinking here today is that making those things more explicit helps everyone, right? It's clear, it's stated. People then know where they stand. They know what they are, not to reuse the word again, but expected to do, how they're expected to behave. So this covers lots of facets, but in this particular area specifically, there are expectations, right? We want you to know how to read these financials. We want you to know how to write a coherent email. I mean, that's a silly example, but say the interoffice dynamics, or say, it's very important in this system, and someone comes in and that's not their style, and nobody's really going to point that out. But let's talk about that. And then we know, and then we can, that's a very simple, mundane example, but then people know what they can improve on and aim to accomplish. So we encourage you to use the Q&A, think about that, write it down for yourself. Don't even need to put it in the Q&A. And I think we're ready to.
Yeah. And
Go ahead.
Shelley, I think to your point, it's like, it's a very common phenomena in family enterprise for people to have expectations of one another, that there's an assumption that everybody else knows. There's also a very common phenomena in family business for expectations to be stated in informal times and not captured, which can lead to disagreement, confusion, disalignment, and even resentment later on down the road when people revisit the expectations and feel like they're not getting the movement that they were expecting as the result of their own actions, because it was never captured and made clear about, okay, this is what you got to do. And so when we think about putting expectations into writing, in a lot of ways, it's like, above all of this, there might be some kind of a goal. And the goal in the development and performance management is, let's say it's Johnny is going to be eventually demonstrating readiness to be in the general manager position. And we take that higher level goal or vision for what it is that you guys are trying to accomplish, and we start to break it down into expectations that go into writing. And the key to capturing expectations in a comprehensive manner is to have a framework, and to know that you are hitting the essence of what is an expectation. And in these 5 bullets here, we're talking about capturing task, which is, the details of what it entails for the particular task,
So let's
or for the particular expectation.
Yeah. So just to pause for 1 second. So this is not, the expectation is not Johnny will develop into the general manager, right? The expectation is Johnny's going to be an effective team leader, or run effective meetings, or fill in your expectation, right?
Exactly. Thank you for that clarification, Shelley. It's like, what are the expectations that need to happen in order to support that readiness? And so with those different expectations, they can exist at different levels. They can exist at an individual competency level, and they can also exist at a broader systems level. And so one expectation, to Shelley's point, is it could be that Johnny is capable of leading client meetings, getting feedback, and integrating that back into their future performance. And that could be an expectation at an individual level. At a higher systems level, it could be that Johnny is going to engage in a comprehensive development program that is going to be defined through these 5 steps. And in this, when we're thinking about the 5 steps that help clarify what those expectations are, we're thinking about the key parts of the task. We're thinking about the steps. We're thinking about what results look like, so the measurable aspects of it. And then we think about reporting. And in reporting, we're thinking about both who they will talk to and the cadence for that reporting. And so in the next couple of slides, what we're going to do is talk about some different ideas and different approaches to gathering and articulating some of the information that is going to get fed into this. And at the end of the webinar, we're going to return to a toolkit form that is going to help you in mapping out what each of these things look like. So one of the first things that comes up here is thinking about the broader goals of the owner, the business leader, in terms of what you're thinking about for the vision of the organization and your own role. And key to this, if you notice here, that helping others set goals doesn't begin with just setting goals for somebody else. Here, the key is to make sure that you know what your own goals are. And you do this before handing this out to others so that you can make sure that when they are setting their goals, that you have surfaced the things that you want them to accomplish. And so they're clearly working towards them. And one of the ways this can play out is you can have a individual leader or a group of leaders work on creating their goals for the future of the organization. And once they have those clearly articulated, that either happens in, one-on-one work with somebody else, or in a partner meeting or an owner meeting. And then you can bring others within the organization into a meeting to talk about what those goals are and to figure out what are some goals that the employees could have, or the family member who's working towards succession that supports those broader goals. So you make sure that there's alignment before you start sending someone down the path of working towards these things. And then again, the ideal here is that you put it in writing. I'm sure a number of you are familiar with Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. One of the steps one of the dysfunctions is around commitment. And the commitment is not, we're all going to do something and we are committing to it. It's the commitment that they're talking about in Lencioni's book is, what are we committing to? And making sure that everybody leaves meetings knowing that they're on the same page about what they're committing to. And when you put things in writing and everybody reviews them together, then it's easy to go back and say, this is what we all committed to, and to check the understanding of the team or the individuals involved to make sure they're on the same page. And from those things, then you can develop clear action steps that are aligned with the stated commitments of the team.
So let's just pause for a minute, Danelle, because I think some people might be thinking, wow, they keep talking about meetings and spending all this time getting ready for things and expectations. And our perspective here is, yeah, we don't want to kill you with meetings. That's not the point. It is the more clear, so the more clarity and the better the communication is, the more streamlined the future gets, right? We reduce that friction that Danelle started with asking about. And so the goal is to have those critical conversations and important conversations, understand what you're thinking I'm supposed to be doing, and I'm able to make it clear what I think I'm supposed to be doing, and let's get there in the right manner and the most productive manner. And that's by having that clarity and understanding.
Absolutely. And I think it can feel like a lot of times when this work or other kinds of work are being done in a family enterprise where it hasn't been the way it was done before, that it, in the way that it may have been done during the entrepreneurial phase was that when a need a need was addressed in the moment, in the office, in the parking lot, at the dinner table. And by evidence of a family being at the point where they're thinking of succession, that was the successful way to do it at that time. And oftentimes the resources that a business at that stage has in time and money and those kinds of things is that's just how it gets done. And so when talking to families about, okay, having these meetings, writing these things down, uh, having one-on-one discussions about goals, it can seem like, oh my God, where am I supposed to find time for that? And I think, Shelley, what I hear you saying with that point you shared is that in reality, it's actually adding that structure in. It saves time in the long run. Because if we think about if you don't do it here and the owner isn't clear or the outgoing leader isn't clear about what they want, and the people who are supposed to be in charge of that next chapter start doing their own thing and working off in a direction that is not aligned with the owner, then there becomes a lot of cleanup work later on that could have been avoided by a meeting that might have seemed a little bit time consuming.
Yeah, and not to take us too far off track, but Danelle, I've been in a situation I expect you have as well with a family where the senior leader just keeps saying they're not ready about the rising generation. And so we try to bring some clarity in. Well, what are the expectations and what's the work style and all sorts of other components as well. But having those conversations and being explicit about the expectations then helps smooth that way. And maybe that person gets ready sooner or is already ready and they just haven't had the appropriate conversations.
Yeah, and I actually I really like that you brought that up. I'm not ready thing. And the reason why I like that is because I don't see that as something that doesn't belong in this process. It's a legitimate position and a legitimate concern that needs to have intentional, explicit discussion directed towards it. Because if you don't, it just starts to add friction.
Correct.
But
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
when we, coming back to this, okay, thinking about action steps, how do we monitor actions? And in a lot of ways, we're kind of getting at, smart goals, things like this, where we have a desired result, which is our goal. And what are the components that we need to be thinking about? And we need to make them measurable. And a lot of times what I see when teams or individuals first start doing this is goals can be sort of missing in the realistic part or the measurable part. And the realistic part is, can it actually be accomplished? And a lot of times when people are first learning to set goals, they may be of too high an order. There's steps that have to be included to work towards a particular desired result. But here we're thinking about what is it that we are hoping is going to happen? Why do we want it? And how are we going to know when it actually did? And with the observable part of this is identifying things that help employees understand what others will be seeing of them to indicate that they are actually working on something, which also tees up the opportunity for meaningful feedback to be built into how teams learn together and how individuals learn about their progress, that employees know that there will be an opportunity that's built into the developmental process for them to get feedback. And these can be a whole variety of things that range from 15-minute meetings to standard performance reviews to mentoring sessions and other kinds of measurables. And on this particular slide, thinking about the balance with delegation, letting go, delegation is letting go, and thinking about striking a balance where you are trying to let people have autonomy, but also providing them with adequate support to develop their skills. There's something that I hear a lot in the family business, family enterprise sphere that is let people make mistakes. And I think that the key here is the balance, is that if you know that somebody is going to, that the actions that they are looking to pursue is 95% going to lead to failure, that might not be where you allow them the autonomy to fail. Instead, it's looking at what is a balance of something that is a challenging task for someone but where they also have a reasonable degree of opportunity to be successful if given the proper support. And a lot of times the way that I think about this is it's like a Venn diagram, and there's the leader and all the things that they have that they do. There's the person that you're trying to develop that is working their way forward and where they overlap. And all the things on the side of the owner circle that are independent of the overlap are the things that the owner is not yet ready to let go of. The things that are on the side of the rising generation member or person who's trying to move into leadership that are clear of that center overlap are all the things that they demonstrate competency in and are capable of doing and are trusted to do on their own. And then where the overlap happens is where this balance between autonomy and adequate support really shows up. And those are the things where the leader is actively involved with the person who is trying to work their way up in guiding them on understanding how to do these things and having clear ideas and expectations around what it's going to look like that demonstrates that that can now move into, I trust you to do this. And then the circles move a little closer together.
Yeah. And I like that example. I like the Venn diagram approach. Having tasks and challenges, right? That items that are challenging and the likelihood of success is greater than 5%, right? Is meaningful. Also, and this, sorry if it's just stating the obvious, having opportunities try and maybe fail when the downside isn't that great, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have the one side, which is the one example, which is you're likely to hit it. It's challenging and you're likely to get there. Or one where you might not, the likelihood might only be 5%, but what's the cost of failure? Not much. So people need to have those. We all know about that. I mean, that's how children grow up and learn, right? So you have to be able to try it yourself to see what's going to happen. But sometimes there's that letting go a piece of it too, right? It might be something that is way too scary for someone who's been in control for a long time and they know that this idea is going to be a mistake. You know, we have to give a slightly longer leash sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely, Shelley. And you make a good point with the cost of failure. And that is for sure a factor that can be built into it. And so it's really sort of, again, striking a balance between all those different factors in a way that makes sure that people are being challenged and that they may sometimes get over their skis, so to speak, but that it's done in a manner where there is a possibility for success more often than just intentionally setting somebody up for failure. And it is, to your point, Shelley, it's an exercise in both somebody taking some chances and stepping into something that seems like a stretch for them and somebody else learning how to let go and be okay with it. And one thing that we talked about in the last webinar that feeds into this particular concept, thinking about what's in the two circles, is that job audit. And so where somebody has captured all the different things that they're responsible for, it can help you to create, this is what this one person is doing in their position. This is what I'm doing in mine. And look, we have some overlap. And I didn't realize that person was working on that. And I'm either comfortable or not with it, or I didn't realize that this person didn't want me to be doing that. So it's an opportunity to get clear about where everybody is. And, all of this too, in terms of development and helping people to progress in organizations, mentoring comes in here in a big way. And I don't know, Shelley, you want to jump in on the mentoring?
Sure. I also want to say, I mean, the thought just struck me that we talk a lot in this field about leadership development and growth. And what I really like right now is we are taking the other perspective. I mean, that's the whole thought about job descriptions and performance management, right? It's a couple things. One is let's have some organizational structure that one might find not in a first or second generation business, but in a larger, older, family business or not. So I'm not saying that family businesses aren't sophisticated because we certainly know plenty of them that are. But lots of times, because they came from the entrepreneurial phase, there's a lot of, we'll just make that decision right now and we'll do it. And no, we don't have job descriptions. And I had a family that said to me recently, oh, yeah, we do reviews, just none of the family. Like everyone else has performance reviews, but none of the family gets reviewed because who would review them was what they said. But taking this perspective is leadership development or, preparing for being a leader. Lots of times we're talking about, oh, what does that person need to do? But here we're really saying, what does the organization need to do? And what do the leaders and maybe the outgoing leader or other people throughout the organization, how do they all support that growth and development? So, and one of the ways is mentors. Danelle and I did do a series on mentoring. And so if you saw that or read about it on our website, some of this might be familiar. But one of the really important roles of a mentor is to be self-aware, sort of just like the slide where Danelle talked about important to set your own goals and understand your own goals before you ask somebody else to set theirs. So as a mentor, really understanding your own situation, how you got to where you are, and when you listen to your mentee or when you're in a conversation, don't overlay your perspective, but really listen for that person's perspective and encourage them to come up with their own solutions before providing answers and solutions. And then, the other things so number two, when the expectation for the mentee is to hold up their part of the relationship. So one of the things that we talk about a lot in mentoring is there's a big responsibility on the part of the mentee to carry the relationship forward. And that's in goal setting, that's in expectations in terms of meetings, missed meetings, someone has to reschedule, that should be the mentee. I mean, if a mentor is always chasing the mentee, that's not the idea. The idea behind the relationship, it's to support the growth of the mentee, and they need to have buy-in. So if the mentor is guiding the relationship in that sort of way, in the structure, from the structure perspective, then it seems like it's really important to the mentor, but not to the mentee. So that needs to be conveyed to the mentee. This is for you. This is for your growth and development. And if certain things like keeping to timelines or goal setting or measuring where you are on your goals, if those are challenges for you as a mentee, let's work on those things. And how can I support you in that way as a mentor? And then, give the proper feedback, the appropriate feedback. If there's a great result, just like, here challenging and you're not holding up your end of the deal, but just on the flip side, wow, this really came through and you really did what you said you were going to do and even more so. And let's grade and maybe let's talk about that too. Let's talk about how that went and how this was a successful outcome for you and how that feels and have all those conversations surrounding it.
Yeah. And in this whole idea of performance management, where the mentor may be, internally, maybe benefiting from what you're trying to accomplish, whether it's, a senior generation to a rising generation within the business. It goes into those things of Shelley, you were talking about in the prior slide, that it's so important that challenging assignments are a part of it. And there's other things that are, important pieces with being a mentor that are creating opportunities for mentees to be able to network or interact with people that they might not have access to on their own. And more over the years, people have, the professional mentoring world has really advocated thinking about mentoring as a network learning experience over just a individual one. That doesn't mean that you can't have an unbelievable experience in a, one-to-one mentoring, but there's also looking at who can I bring in to help support what we're working on. And critical to mentoring and just development in general is good feedback. And a number of years ago, working with a client, I was always really surprised when anytime I would bring up, hey, let's work on how you give each other feedback, and everyone would cringe. I was like, why wouldn't you want to do that? Feedback is great. Feedback is how we get to know how people are experiencing us and how we capture ideas for, ways that we can do things more intentionally to improve going forward. But feedback is not always defined properly. And in some families and relationships, feedback is criticism. And so part of what we have to do is we have to first figure out how everybody is defining feedback. And if it's seen as something that is a negative, then we need to talk about how we inform each other in a way that best eradicates the things that are actually not really feedback. They may be judgment. They may be criticism. They may be ascribing intention of other people's motives. We have to learn how to pull those out and come up with what is a healthy understanding of good feedback. And good feedback at its core is actually neither positive or negative. The model that I like to teach comes from a leadership development program that I worked with on the mainland for a number of years. And what we want to make sure we do is that we are stating an observable behavior. And then we are saying, and this is the impact that it is having on me or the group. So for example, you may say, I noticed that during the meeting, oftentimes you would raise your voice, and the impact was that other members in the group stopped asking questions. And we aren't stating when we use that model that this is anything other than something that we observed, both in terms of a behavior and an impact.
Here, and I'll give you another example that might then be less incendiary. I noticed that your posture is often sort of arms crossed and leaning back, and the group interprets that as uninterested or bored.
Well, but here I'm going to challenge you on that, Shelley, because when we do that, we're speaking for others in the group, and we don't know that that's how they interpret it.
So the impact on the group is right. Okay.
So it could be in that case, the impact on me is I feel like you might be disinterested, which leads us to how you do it as an individual. And when you do it as an individual, you state something you observed, and then you share the impact it had on you as a feeling.
Got it. Yep.
And in that case, you absolutely can say that.
Okay.
Got it. And so, but the other part here, and Shelley's right, there isn't just incendiary examples of this. This is also helping people to understand very clearly what they're doing right. And so Shelley, when you jump in and ask a question while we're discussing a concept on these slides that demonstrates an opportunity to take things more deeply, the impact on me is that I start considering things that I might not have thought about in the moment if I was just doing this by myself. And I appreciate that. And so there's a way to help give people a specific example of something they're doing that is helpful the impact it's having on you, and then they know what to do to keep things moving forward. The most common thing people do around that kind of feedback is they say, Shelley, it's so great the way you helped me out in this webinar. And Shelley can go, okay, that's cool, but what was I doing? How do I repeat that in the next slide or in the future?
Right.
And so good feedback is specific, timely. We don't wait for months to go by or weeks to go by. It's direct. It's behavioral focus. It describes an impact. It's actionable. So the person can, through the behavior and the impact, can have a clear understanding of what they can do to either lessen or increase or modify their behavior in the future to be impactful. And so it's helpful there. I'm going to go into the next one here. So transitioning your role. This is a really, to me, I think this is a really interesting way of thinking about this, because if we look at this as a timeline, there's a current state, there's a future state, and there's the state in between getting there. And sometimes it can feel like this is the linear process that you want to follow to get to the future state, from your current state, interim state, and future state. And to some extent, that's true. But when we're thinking about this from planning and developmental and performance management, what we want to do is make sure that we are capturing what the current state is for the existing leader. And then we want them to, secondly, go to the future state and capture what is the vision for the future of where they want things to go. And with those two sets of data, we're better informed for how we can define the interim state. And so in the broader work of working with families in business, it's most common that the way that it gets approached when there's an advisor involved is there's some kind of preliminary assessment which captures what is the current state, where things have been up until this point. And from that, there is some kind of discussion about, well, where do you want to go? And creating a shared vision. And from that shared vision perspective coming into the fold, we can say, okay, here's where we are. Here's where we want to go. Here's what we need to do. And that's the interim state. Shelley, in your work, how do you think about this? Is this way that I'm talking about something that you see as well?
Yeah, and I was just thinking about a couple cases where I would think, so there's a leader who might be transitioning, and instead of future state, we might call it ideal state. Like if you could you're not leaving entirely, but you're giving up a lot of the stuff, and you're going to be just sort of hanging around, not making trouble, but in a emeritus position, maybe, let's say. And what are the things that you really enjoy that you still want to do? But what are all the other things that you're going to have other people take over or do? And then that becomes the interim state. And I really like at the last sentence under that, that there may be several interim states. So it's as we gradually peel off some of these things, who's going to be doing those and what's that going to look like?
Yeah, I like that. And that the several interim states, the way that I often talk about this with clients is something that Leslie had brought to my awareness a number of years ago. And what she talked about is she presented a visual of a pitchfork, and that there's a multiple prongs that are going forward from the current state to the future state. And one of the things that's particularly interesting about that model is that you are not always moving all of them forward at the same time. And you may reach points where in an interim state, one lane of that interim state, you run into a block and somebody's unwilling to give up authority in a particular area or unwilling to share information. And if you stay trying to push that particular prong forward from that perspective, you can run into a standstill. And instead, what often breaks the impasse on one particular path that you're trying to move forward is pausing and saying, where else can we make progress on the different prongs that we're trying to move forward? And we're going to pause this one for now. And you go to the others. And sometimes by virtue of going through one of the others, you uncover that there was something around trust or something around an individual's vision for the future that wasn't being satisfied in the way that a person needed it to move forward in that one particular prong. And all of a sudden, by working on more clearly articulating some of what a leader's going to be doing in their retirement, suddenly makes it clear that, hey, I'm okay with delegating this piece now under these terms. And that other one starts to move forward.
Yeah. And I have a family who I worked with, and actually they, thinking about this kind of approach, the leader came up with it on their own. I was working with them on succession and some other issues, but that this person presented a plan to me, and it was adding another layer in the organization management, so that that person, the original leader, could transition to a higher level and a more hands-off level. And then, because that was the end goal, right? And then creating these interim states and the planning and the progression that each of the people who were going to move into those more management level leadership roles, what they needed to do to get to those places, and planned it out in a timeline.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, and then coming back to this too, is there's also current state can be getting a read on, what is happening more globally in a family business, but it can also be getting a read on things that are more individually focused and thinking about how we understand those. And one of those particular facets is thinking about where a person is in their given moment relative to their aspirations for leadership. And when we think about the development of leadership, there's lots of different models out there for how you could go at, moving from where you are now to moving to where you're making highly effective decisions and having a big impact. But almost universally, these models tend to be built on a foundation of self-awareness that moves into self-management. And when we think about self-awareness, what we're doing is we are getting to know ourselves. And ideally, I like to think of this from the perspective of like a Hogan assessment, which is a really comprehensive self-awareness building tool. And they describe what that does as building strategic self-awareness. And building strategic self-awareness because you are learning about yourself and how others experience you in a manner that allows you to then take action in a way that is that self-management piece to make sure that others around you and outcomes that you're pursuing are in more consistently aligned with your intentions. And so there's different ways at going at building self-awareness. Psychological assessments. They can be, personality profiles. And those can raise like the self-awareness of an entire group, helping people to understand differences. There's things that dig more deeply, like the Hogan, which gets at things, what are people's drivers? What are the cultures that they thrive in? Whether they're inherent biases? What is the type of culture that they tend to promote? It also helps people to understand how they are experienced in favorable ways generally and how they tend to be experienced in ways related to derailers. There's also 360s. So there's a number of different, options for how you do that in an organization. And when you're thinking about 360s, it's not always the best option to say, hey, let's do a 360 for this individual and let them hear from everybody. If your family business or organization doesn't have the culture to support that being done in a productive way, it can be risky to do it that way. And there's different versions of 360s that you can take into consideration if that's the case. So there's comprehensive ones, and then there are things that people refer to as like a mini 360, where you have sort of tighter parameters on where a person's getting feedback. There's building in feedback into teams, teaching people about what feedback looks like when it's done with that observation impact model, and how that is different from giving advice or stating your opinion or, ascribing malintent or those kinds of things. And there's performance reviews also come into this. Shelley, am I missing anything in terms of opportunities to promote self-awareness? Would you add
No,
anything?
I was thinking back to the mentor-mentee relationship too, and how we talk about a positive attribute of a successful mentor is to have self-awareness and self-management. And so building that in as a future leader or as a leader or as a future mentor is important. And I would say also the mentor relationships can come into this as well. This is not an assessment, but this is another way to get honest feedback and in a face-to-face interchange that where there's safety, right? And willingness to be vulnerable. So with a trusted partner, I think is a great opportunity as well.
Yeah, and something else comes to mind with you mentioning that, and that is that generally speaking, if a person is a candidate for moving into leadership, they're usually falling close enough to the acceptable range of growth that needs to be made that the adjustments a person may require, it depending on the time frame as well. So if we're talking about a progression from one level of management to another over the next 2 years, then the individual who's moving forward and the individual who is giving them the space to, occupy as a leader are both in a place where they aren't necessarily needing to focus on huge change. And sometimes I find that when people come into making personal change, they're like, oh God, I've got to change everything about who I am. Or, I've got to be, this person needs to be a completely different person. What I like to encourage them to think about is that book by Malcolm Gladwell called The Tipping Point. And there's an important concept in there. And that is that if 90% represents the threshold where something goes from not being effective to being effective, you need to be at 90% to be effective. And if you are at 89%, you only need to make 1% of change, 86%, 4% of change. And so in the years that I was working with the leadership development program, the way that I would tell people to think about changing their behaviors to help them have a greater impact as they are working towards leadership is not to think of it as you need to turn the stereo necessarily from 2 to 8, but it's from 2 to 3 might just make it sound good enough that it's actually doing what you want it to do. And there's a tendency a lot of times in personal development for people to swing wide. So if they don't talk a lot in meetings and that's being raised to them, they might start talking too much in meetings. And in talking in too much in meetings, they brush up against some feedback over there that helps them recalibrate. But it's not to go all the way back. It's just to recalibrate to where you're hitting that tipping point in terms of making impact. And this takes us back to this toolbox. And what we did, we're going to be posting this on the website. This is a form that sort of captures those bullet points that we raised earlier in our discussion today. What are the key parts to the task? What steps will be involved? What should the results look like? Who will the employee need to talk to? When should the employee report back? That's attached to an expectation statement. And so there's different levels of how you can approach expectations. If we go back to the goal of Johnny being ready in a ready position in 2 years to be the general manager, then there are expectations associated with how Johnny will engage with a developmental pathway that is, kind of comprehensive. And, I think about it's like when we're thinking about the task, it's like, what roles does this entail? What skills need to be developed? What capabilities need to be addressed? And who are the mentors? And then we start thinking about steps and defining the target role, assessing readiness, identifying priority areas for development. And when we get into what the results should look like, that's where we're saying we want evidence of success. Like, what does it look like that we know we're making progress? And then the who will the employees need to talk to and when should the employees report back? We're getting to the key touch points. It's like the who and when, the cadence of how you're tracking it. If we're thinking about this where the expectation is more of a singular task that might exist underneath the broader development, we're thinking about Johnny can effectively facilitate one client meeting a month, get feedback and demonstrate that they are integrating that feedback into how they run the next one. We have that. And then again, we go back down here and what the key parts of the task include. It might be prep, meeting prep, facilitation, follow through, handling feedback. Those might be the pieces there. The steps might be, pick the right meeting, draft the agenda, review with the mentor, et cetera, et cetera. And then defining what the results look like and making sure to define those key touch points. Shelley, would you add
Yes.
anything there?
No, I think this is good. I want to just circle back actually because we have some other toolkits as well. And I so want to highlight them. We don't have them in the deck right here, but they're going to be on the website where you'll find this webinar recording as well. And those are an individual development plan, an onboarding program, all in a format that's easy to follow, easy to use, job tasks, career planning from a broad perspective, sort of starting out at the top and circling back to the message at the top of the hour that we don't want to kill you with meetings. We want to give you these tools so that then you can have an easier pathway, both as someone in an organization figuring out who's going into what role, whether you're an exiting leader or someone coming into the organization or rising up through it, sort of removing that friction, making those pathways smoother and easier and known to everybody. This is what we do. We sort of follow this. So not to create a lot of paperwork and not to make things more onerous, but to acknowledge and understand that you might have a really small staff. You might have a small organization. We don't have a big HR department running these things. So here's a booklet. Here's a play-by-play. Here are some things that you can do to help move people through the system, whether that's up and lovely retirement, whether that's coming up, and just starting out or anywhere in between.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point is that there is the version of this for you is dependent on all of the factors that exist within your own family business. And if you've got, 5 people in the office and you're working on moving one person up, there's one version of that. And it's important that it is something that's sustainable for you to work on. And if you have a family business that has, 300 employees and you're working on moving 5 people up, there's another version of this that is more involved and more complicated. But ultimately, the key to remember here is that using structure and doing it right the first time may seem like a lot of work in the moment, but it will save endless lost opportunity going forward by making sure that everyone's on the same page and clear about what is expected, both in terms of currently for growth and development and what a person who is doing the growth and development can expect in terms of autonomy and authority later on down the road.
And we are just about out of time. I want to thank Danelle and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Our next webinar is on September 8th, and we are going to highlight boards, not the importance of boards of directors, but really how to operate a board. So giving you those nuts and bolts, those tools, agenda preparation, yearly calendars, things like that to really help you be successful in that area as well. And we do have a coffee in August, and I was just trying to check on that date for you. And maybe Adelaide can throw that in the chat if she has that handy. But we are out of time for today. So thank you all for joining us. Danelle, thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, everyone.